tell me again how and why your family came into the area?
Well, going back to my grandfather, he was born in Douvill, Quebec, and it was quite a large family. Their mother died, and my grandfather, at 12 years old, he had to go to work, and he started working in a sawmill near Montreal. And while he was working there, he had heard through men talking about bringing the cribs of squared timbers from Belleville down out in the lake and down the St. Lawrence River to Montreal, and they were being shipped to England for shipbuilding masts. So he thought that maybe that was an adventure, so he made the connections and got a job as a cookee, helping the cook. And they brought him by boat, him with the crew of men, up to Belleville, and the cribs of timber were put together there. And on top of the crib would be a camp for men to stay in, the cookery, and they lived completely up on top of the crib of timbers. And the crew of men had to pull the crib when the water wouldn't float it along. They had to push it and steer it by long poles. So he worked for a season, or a couple of seasons, yes, up as cookee, helping the cook. He did all the peeling potatoes and whatnot. And then he decided he'd like to adventure a little farther north, so he came back to Belleville and he followed the logging trail north. He wanted to get in on cutting of the timbers, so he came up near Flinton, and the Rathbun Lumber Company had left had a depot there, and they had left it and went on up to the Deer Rock Lake area. And he sort of went in, moved in just to have a place to stay, and he got work with the Rathbun Lumber Company. Then on north, he was called a chopper. He helped to build the roads in the fall, well, summer and fall, so that they could sleigh haul the logs out to dump them on the marshes and ponds, wherever, to float them out in the spring. And during the course of living there at the old depot, there were people across the way, just across the road, actually the trail at that time, and they had several girls, and he met the one, and eventually they got married, and then he took up residence, set up the home in the old depot. Well, later on, he got title to it. It was given by the Crown, and the family grew up. They had a family of 7 boys and 4 girls. And but he still carried on working in the lumber camps. And then my dad then sort of followed in. He started cookee for the river drivers as they moved their camps down the Skootamatta River and eventually on through the Montreal to Belleville. But my grandfather, that was his main thing in life, was logging, and he was pretty good with the broadaxe. He squared timbers, and whatever came along in the logging industry, he could do it. So, but My dad then, he worked in logging till it left. It all closed down eventually. There was no more. A lot of the big companies were gone. The timber was gone, but they still lived in the area and took up farming to more or less to survive. And
The logging down the Skootamatta, was that dangerous work?
yes, actually there are several men buried along the Skootamatta River on the shores. There's one not too far from here, just down below where Eddie Yance lives. There's one man was killed there, another one down below at Simpson Chutes below Sturgeon Panier's place. And
Why was it dangerous? How did they die?
well, the logs would catch along the shoreline, and they get what they call a jam. They just pile up there, and then men had to go in those logs and break the log loose that was causing the jam. Well, in a lot of cases, the logs just come tumbling. I heard my dad say they just come end over end, right down. So much water would back up behind that once you got them free, they'd just come every which way. If you were in the wrong place, well, you were down. You was crushed, held underwater, and drowned. But
So how did they get if you go through there now, the water's not very high. Where did they dam up the water to get the water level high enough to float logs down there?
well, at that time, they built dams all along the river. Used to be one in Flinton, and on down somewhere around the Reed's Bridge area, and every so far, they put a dam or had a dam built, log dam, and they held the water up at that dam so it floated the logs down to that point. Well, then they'd open that dam, and the flow of water would move to the next dam, and that would float the logs. And they did that right on down the river. That's the way they kept the water high enough, just from one dam to another, to float the logs through. Well, then, after the main drive was gone through, they always did this in high water in the spring to catch the melt off to get the extra water. Well, then after the main drive was gone, they used to have a crew that came down with a couple horses and men with long poles, and the logs that were pushed up on shore and were caught somewhere along, they'd roll them back into the river. The flow was a lot lower, but still there was enough to float the scattered logs down, and they were the tailing crew. They brought all the logs that were caught up, brought them all down through to eventually wound up in Belleville. But it was a dangerous job because you were out there on those logs in the water, and they could spin, and they do a lot of things. It was unpredictable. The old log sleighs, like where I said my grandfather worked, he was a chopper, worked on preparing these roads. Well, they used to level them up in the fall, or in the summer and fall, chop out all the old stumps or trees that was in the road, make them as level as possible, and follow the lower ground so there'd be no hills to go up. They would go down hills, but they wouldn't never take a load up. And they used to, as soon as the snow came, they would go through and break a sleigh track with their logging sleighs. And then they had a sleigh with a wooden tank onto it. And they'd go down to a lake or a stream, fill that full of water, and they had a plug on each back corner, two back corners, that was right in line with the sleigh track. And they'd take this tank of water and go with the horses, pull out the plug, and they'd water the sleigh track. And they keep doing that until they had a solid ice sleigh track. And then the sleighs for hauling logs, of course, would slide easier on the ice, and it was solid. They used to have men, they called chickadees, that carried a broom and a shovel, and they went along and kept all the manure that would get in, the horse manure that would get into the sleigh track. They'd sweep it all out and kept it clean. Each man had so far to go and so much to look after. And the hills that they went down, they had a sander or sandman. He used to heat the sand, and when he'd see a sleigh coming, he would put the hot sand in each wheel or each sleigh track, and the hot sand would hold the load back. So otherwise, if he didn't have enough sand, or it wasn't hot enough, the load would get away from the horses sometimes and just pick them right up, and as a rule, it would kill the horses and the teamster too, because it would leave the road as a rule and just drive them right into the bush. But that was a very important job, the man that was looking after the sanding. He had to have his temperature right and the proper amount of sand. So.
That term chickadee is kind of interesting. Now, why would they call a person a chickadee that would keep the manure out of the sleigh track?
Well, just more or less, chickadees would eat the grain out of the horse manure, so.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
It was more or less a nickname that was given to them because they picked it up.
Right. Can you describe, when you started logging up here, you were talking about it was mainly for survival, and what it was like to live up here during the war years? How the war affected this area?
Well, as I say, cutting timber was a survival because the families back in the 30s, the main process, the main thing that you had to do was to provide feed for your family, food for your family, feed for your livestock. And you try to have enough hay to feed your cattle, which in turn gave you meat, milk, butter, and you grew vegetables, you grew potatoes, you grew turnips, you grew enough stuff to put your family through the winter for food. And if you could make, if you had $100 in the fall that you could make from selling timber, you were well off for the winter, because that would buy you maybe the tea, the sugar, flour, a few things that you had to buy. Otherwise, you grew everything else yourself. And even to tobacco, my dad smoked a pipe, but he grew his own tobacco. And a lot of the families I know around the area did just that. That it was a means of survival, and you grew everything you could to survive. But then you come on in the war years, Second World War, things were quite, you had no hydro through the area. Everything was rationed. Your food was rationed, a lot of food. Meat was rationed, sugar, or gasoline, a lot of your food supply was rationed. Well, the people that were growing their own, of course, they weren't too bad, but people living in the towns, they were pretty hard hit, and they used to have gardens or get gardens out in the surrounding areas from farmers that had a little extra space, and they'd grow as much stuff right in the town. Pretty everybody kept a few hens. They'd fatten a pig and got by growing as much of their own food as possible. But it was, I still have ration books here that shows you get, for pleasure driving your car, you got 10 gallons of gas a month. And if you were on a farm and used your vehicle for farm use, you got a little more. And if you were a trucker hauling farm produce, well, you get more gas, but it was still limited to, you probably get maybe 50, 100 gallons of gas then a month. But you were, for pleasure, you were allowed 10 gallons. That was the limit. Tires were rationed, and you had to, quite a process. Just for pleasure, you couldn't get a tire, but you had a farm or a business, you could get a tire. And that was quite a process that you had to go through to get it. But
I guess in some ways there would be an advantage to being a farm or a business.
oh yes, a business. And even beer was rationed. And they had one brand of beer, Blue Top beer. That was, no matter what you wanted, it was Blue Top. The beer was sent overseas to the soldiers, so they made one brand here. And that was it.
Now, where was that made? In Toronto?
Well, the breweries all made, well, the big companies, Bradings and Molson's and all that made it, but it was, well, sold under one name, Blue Top. There was, I don't know what the reason was there, but it was.
Can you tell us about the, when you started logging, there wasn't any chainsaws, and you mentioned you had one of the first chainsaws in the area?
Yes, back when we started, we were cutting, like primarily cutting veneer, alum veneer for sold the Lost Channel down below Chapman's Corner and Tweed. They made cheese box. They turned their own veneer, and they made the cheese box. Well, that created a market back through this area, because there was, at that time, quite a bit of alum. And then it was, of course, cut with the crosscut saw, limbed with the axe, and skidded with horses, and drew by sleigh out to where you could get it onto a truck. You had to bring it out to a main road somewhere. And this, went on till after the war. And the Power Machine Company in British Columbia, they sent a salesman through the area demonstrating the new power saw they had come out with. And the thing weighed about 30 pounds, but it was something new, or something that cut fast. It didn't have the chipper chain. It had a chain with 2 rows of straight teeth into it, or onto it. But it cut pretty good. And you had to start with a rope. You had to wind up a rope to the side, pull it, rewind it. And when you wanted to fall with it, you had to hang on the carburetor, turn the machine over on its side, so the carburetor was always kept level to fall a tree. And then when you wanted to cut it up, cross-cut it, you had to hang on the carburetor, turn the machine back level again, so the carburetor stayed level to saw with. But my dad and I had the first machine first power chainsaw in this Flinton, Kildare-Cloyne area. And then maybe power machine within McCullough and a few others came out shortly after, within a year or so. Then they became more popular. But
how much did it change as far as, like, could you do, half again as much work in a day, or double, or?
oh, you would well, really it depended. In maybe bigger stuff, you'd cut more than you would with the crosscut. But in stuff maybe a foot through or so, I think crosscut was just about as fast. Two good men with a crosscut.
But with the chainsaw, you only needed one, or did you need two?
Well, no, with the chainsaw, you only needed one man, and you would gain that way. You'd save one man.
But then you had to buy gas for it too.
But you had to buy gas and oil. You had to, of course, at that time they didn't have the mixes. You bought ordinary motor oil. You had to mix your gas and motor oil, and of course, a gallon of gas then and a quart of oil didn't cost as much as a liter does today.
You worked for the Lands and Forests for a while?
Yes.
What did you do for them?
Well, I started in March 1948, and I was, I started out on reforestation, and I became reforestation supervisor for the Tweed District. And I was in charge then of all the reforestation that went on in the Tweed District. And then I went on from that to office in Napanee, where I was in charge. Well, my job more or less was a lot of, to go way back again, people that had bought land, and there was adjacent Crown land. They got a quitclaim deed to that land to use it. You use it for pasture or whatever, agriculture. But through time, a lot of these quitclaim deeds were just sort of put in with their regular deeds, and they changed hands through the family, 3 or 4 generations, and people had no title. They had a quitclaim deed, but they had no title to the land. Well, the Crown wanted to clear that up, so I was in the Tweed District. That was my job, to start going to the owners that had quitclaim deed in their property and assess it, and if it was good productive land, they were charged a bit for it, according to what it was worth. You had a little black book to go by, and people, some got quite hostile because you were going to come and tell them they had to pay for this land that they already owned. And I know I was called a few names different times. I was just hiding behind the uniform. But it got pretty hostile at times, so I decided to move on.
The area, as I understand, the first cut went through in the late 1800s. The area must have looked a lot different even into when you were born you were born in the 30s or 20s?
1926.
1926? How did the area look back then?
Well, from the time I can remember it was sure a lot more open than today. I could, when I was small, I could stand in my original home was right down back here. Could stand in the yard and see the steeple in the Catholic Church in Flinton, which was 3 miles, And there was one tree that stood out. It's up where Clifford York has his house now. There was one big pine stood up there. That was the only tree that you would see between here and the steeple, Flinton.
Hmm.
And all these fields through here that are reforested now, they were all open. Every dwelling along the way, each property, there was a family lived on it, and they existed off of those properties. But after the Second World War, of course, things began to open up. People started to leave and go out to work and factory jobs and whatnot, and they became more or less left. Now, so the county, the township had taken a lot of them back for back taxes, and then it got such a load, the county took a bunch of that property, and then they started a reforestation program and put a lot of it back into forests.
So the county forest kind of started from getting property back
From townships to start with. But then they went on and purchased, I don't know if they purchased the, the county bought after that they bought property, the one around Flinton, the county bought that property, they bid on it and got it too. And back, like the first, more or less I got acquainted with the Mazenau area was after Sawyer and Stoles came in. And in fact, you didn't travel that far, but almost after, during the latter part of the war years, up in 44, 45, that never got back to Sawyer and Stoles and see the timber that was being cut there. But all you had to do was go to 41 Highway and see Sawyer and Stoles trucks going there 24 hours a day, hauling stuff.
And they were taking it to where?
Caladar, to the planing mill in Caladar. And they ran 24 hours a day. And they put hemlock on the market. Prior to that, hemlock didn't sell locally. Of course, they were shipping a lot of it to the States, but it went out of there by the train load.
So would that hemlock been left over from the first cut, or they didn't take that?
They didn't take it. Back in the original cut, pine was the only thing they cut. I know my dad said working, I heard my grandfather say the same thing. My dad said the falling pine, they'd look for another big hardwood, if possible, and they'd fall the big pine right into a big hardwood to break its fall, so that it wouldn't, if it hit a rock or something, it would maybe break it, and they'd lose quite a bit because it would shatter. So whenever possible, they'd fall right into another hardwood and just crush them down. Or we'd still had abundance of timber in this area, but when they cut everything clear and then burned it afterwards, they killed everything. And so there was quite a period of time where you didn't have timber. It is starting now to come back, but that's 100 years or so later. And the idea of reforesting plus properties now that aren't cut as close. I know my own property here, it has really come back on its own. And white pine is the main species coming back, and it's really doing well. There just was nothing left, and then that's large areas they burnt, like the slash that was left from logging so heavy, it was just burnt off. And then when they burnt that off, what soil that was built up over the rocks burned away too. They were right back to bare rocks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know. I think that going way back of things that I've heard, Dad always talked about my grandfather. I've sat and listened to him talking about working in the bush and the different jobs. And he drove river and chopped. One of the a chopper's duty, what they call a chopper, his duty was to all those big pine. It was a three-man crew, a chopper and two sawyers. The chopper, he had to chop a notch, decide which way the tree was to fall, chop the notch in the tree so that it would fall in that direction. The sawyer sawed it down, and the chopper, he had to trim the tree and chop the top off and also measure out the logs to be cut out of that tree and keep the sawyer, the two-man sawyer crew, busy all the time because they worked on piecework and they didn't want to be held up. And if they didn't have a good chopper that broke too many trees, didn't have them falling into something or where they were cushioned so they wouldn't break, well, the men couldn't put up the logs. They blamed the chopper, and a good chopper was worth his weight in gold to a crew that was sawing. But
Hard work back then.
it was hard work, and it was daylight to dark. Grandfather says you went out in the morning, you were out to your site by daylight, and you left the bush when you couldn't see anymore. So that was a day's work. Like with if they didn't use spruce or cedar boughs on their bunk bed, they would get lousy. And body lice would stay in their bunks. So apparently there's something in cedar and there was something in spruce that the lice didn't like, and they wouldn't stay in their bunks. And
I guess it's a long time between baths.
well, yeah, a lot of them went to the camp in the fall with new clothes, and they wore them. They come out in the spring. That's all winter.
Take a long bath to
Yeah,
get that smell out. Wouldn't it?
because unless you wanted to chop a hole through the ice, jump in the lake, there was no other way of you could wash your hands and face and maybe sponge bath a bit, but there was no bathrooms. Or they said that they used to joke about, but it's maybe not. The toiletry then was a pole set up in the bush. You sat on the pole.
Wow. Tough times.
Times were sure different than today.